Random theology here. I wanted to go over my new paper that I released. It is unpublished, but I felt it might be helpful to have a video on it, possibly give some commentary why the paper was written. So I wrote a paper, the title, the tentative title, I guess, what I have set thus far, it is God with Us. So the title is God with Us, subtitled Christian Complex Theism. And I borrow that term, Christian Complex Theism, from Caleb Coho. He wrote an interesting paper, so I borrowed it from him. And I've heard this term, complex theism, from Khalil Andani and Joshua Sijiwati, so I wanted to just use it. So we'll discuss it, but before I do, I'll give you just some background on the paper. I listened to a critique of a scholar, and I felt that critique was unfair or uncharitable and uncritical. So I felt that I should just put some of my ideas together into a paper and at the same time address some objections that I've heard. So that is the reasoning or motivation behind the paper. And so the fruit of my thought process and compiling is this paper. So the abstract, I say, in epistemology, Agrippa's trilemma, sometimes this is called the Munchausen trilemma, or Munchausen, something like that in German. But in epistemology, Agrippa's trilemma attempts to demonstrate epistemic justification is fundamentally unprovable, circular, or an infinite regress. Each form of ultimate epistemic justification is associated with foundationalism, coherentism, or infinitism. So depending upon which view you take for Agrippa's trilemma, you will either become a foundationalist, a coherentist, or an infitist, butchering that name, infitist. In this paper, I will explore two versions of Christian complex theism. The first version may be a type of metaphysical foundationalism. It takes the real essential definition of God as the first principle in metaphysical construction. The second version is a metaphysical coherentism. I take God as a tripartite complex being who is the terminus of all metaphysical explanation. I will show both versions of Christian complex theism are plausible with equal explanatory power as rival conceptions of God. And so the main thesis is to explore these two different conceptions of Christian complex theism. So I start off with a few presuppositions. So the first one is methodological rationalism. I start with a type of methodological rationalism. It strikes me that Christians may construct coherent and consistent models of Christian doctrines, demonstrating that they are not essentially incoherent nor inconsistent. Yet such coherent models may or may not be true. Consequently, Christians may remain tentative or agnostic to the truthfulness of coherent models in virtue of an epistemic stance of Mysterianism, fostering epistemic humility. So I start with methodological rationalism. And in terms of the organization of my paper, I also put something else later in the paper that perhaps it would be better to state here, and that is the issue of divine incomprehensibility and predication about God, religious language. R.T. Mullins, in one of his papers on the creator-creature distinction, makes a good point that analogical or univocal predication is irrelevant, but I do take a stand here. I say this: a strong doctrine of divine incomprehensibility and analogical predication may be both susceptible to intractable problems. Divine incomprehensibility, when precisely defined, seems to oscillate between affirming God necessarily and sufficiently can be defined and known, and God necessarily and sufficiently cannot be defined and known. Mere humans cannot completely and entirely define and know God, because human definitions and knowledge are qualitatively and or quantitatively different. If divine incomprehensibility is grounded in a qualitative difference in knowledge, then inscrutability and ineffability obtains. God is unknowable. But if divine incomprehensibility is grounded in a quantitative difference in knowledge, then divine incomprehensibility asserts humans are not omniscient, thus cannot know God exhaustively. So that's the first point for divine incomprehensibility. Now we move on to predication. I say here, if analogical predication denies all univocal predication, so if analogical predication denies all univocal predication, then it collapses to equivocal predication, since analogical predication is grounded by the conjunction of univocal and equivocal predication. And this argument comes from Thomas Williams. He has a paper on the doctrine of univocity. His paper is entitled "The Doctrine of Univocity is True and Salutary," and it's in Modern Theology. So those are the ways I see it. So in some sense, I'm not saying that divine incomprehensibility is incoherent, but we need to be very careful how we understand that. And then on the issue of predication, analogical predication is fine as long as you grant some univocal predication. So it's more of a modest view on that issue. Now we get into the paper. I will loosely follow John Duns Scotus to explore the first version of Christian complex theism. As I understand Scotus, he sees all being, prior to any analysis, as categorically infinite or finite. God alone is the sole infinite being that is the source of all finite beings. And what I'm referring here is to creation, right? This is not an emanation. This is creation, creatio ex nihilo. This provides a precise creator-creature distinction. Contemporary theology may go further in terms of modal or non-modal essentialism to explicate the creator-creature distinction, which we will consider later. I take Scotus to affirm in close proximity that God is a single substance with numerically distinct attributes or properties, in which God is the fundamental asymmetrical explanation or ground for them. For Scotus, there is complexity in God without composition, precisely due to God's nature. Composition is a fusion of created and separable parts. A part is, at the very least, not the whole substance, regardless of separability of properties, from separability of parts or properties. A part can properly represent the whole and share essential properties of the whole. Composition for Scotus may be analyzed as any F, which is feature. Any F is a part of E, essence, if and only if F, the feature, is separable from E, the essence. Separability is what specifies composition. Since God cannot decompose, God cannot be composed. Nevertheless, God is a complex being. God has distinct properties that are unitatively contained by God. And I have a footnote here for what unitative means. So I put here in a footnote, the substance is the container of the formally distinct properties. And I footnote Dominic Lemontia in his paper. Continuing. God is the property bearer of God's properties. God's essential properties are uncreated, inseparable, indivisible, and infinite, thus cannot count as a composed fusion. And J.T. Passage argues that for Scotus, it is a infinite fusion bond, not a created composition. Continuing on. God's unique possession, fusion bond, ownership of his properties ground them as divine, or constitute them divine, if you want to use constitution. So what intrinsically, essentially, and eternally is produced or possessed by God ad intra is God ad intra. So we move on to metaphysical foundationalism. All that I've said thus far could be consistent with both a metaphysical foundationalism or a metaphysical coherentism on how we understand Christian complex theism. So here I go into metaphysical foundationalism and I discuss two objections. I discuss bootstrapping from Lindsay Cleveland. So Lindsay K. Cleveland, and then I discuss a dilemma from Khalil Andani, Dr. Khalil Andani. So let's start first with Lindsay K. Cleveland. So Lindsay K. Cleveland argues if God is a complex being, then a bootstrapping problem obtains. God's essential nature depends on God's numerically distinct essential properties. Yet God's numerically distinct essential properties depend on God's essential nature. Thus, a vicious circularity ensues. Paul M. Gould has offered a metaphysical account with substantial priority and real essentialism to overcome this bootstrapping problem. I will sketch some of his reply. Substances are prior to their parts or properties. Substances are the fundamental asymmetrical ground for their parts or properties. A substance explains the identity and existence of its properties. A substance has a real essential definition for what it is. God is by definition a personal being of a divine kind. And I add, I revised Dr. Gould's definition. I say that we should revise the real definition to a tri-personal being of a divine kind, to be explicitly Christian or Trinitarian. I take the divine kind essence to be primitively a se, that is to say fundamental, self-existent, necessary, self-explanatory, and perfect. The modal status is fixed by the divine essence kind. And I get this by my corresponding with Dr. Gould. Dr. Gould's solution provides a fitting metaphysical foundationalism. The divine substance with its essential real definition is the divine substance with its real essential definition is the foundation to ground its numerically distinct divine properties or parts. Now moving on to Khalil Andani's dilemma. Dr. Khalil Andani, in his debate with Jake Bracatella, he poses this interesting dilemma. Dr. Andani takes aseity as ontological independence. He argues that if God has numerically distinct parts or properties, and those numerically distinct parts or properties depend on God, then they lack aseity. But if God's numerically distinct parts or properties lack aseity, they cannot properly be divine. This dilemma hinges on the definition of aseity. If aseity is defined as uncreated, uncaused, and necessary, then properties may be a se. But if the definition is primarily independence, then the dilemma must be reckoned with. And I would assume that that is an adequate definition of aseity, so we need to give a response. Given substantial priority, a substance explains the identity and existence of its parts and properties. Perhaps a distinction between fundamental and derivative aseity may be formulated. The divine properties are derivatively ase in relation to anything external to the divine nature, and the divine nature is construed as the conjunction of the divine substance and the divine properties. The divine properties do not depend upon anything non-divine, anything external to the divine nature. And that might be charged as being ad hoc. But this is something that Christians have used. You can look at Timothy Paul's paper, Conciliar Trinitarianism, Divine Identity Claims and Subordination in Theologica. Another response to the dilemma is to challenge the coherence of ase properties. So in some sense, it is this neo-Aristotelianism challenging a robust understanding of Platonism. If properties are either possessed or produced by a substance, then properties characterized as ase are similar to square circles. They're metaphysically impossible. If ase properties are metaphysically impossible, then it is not a liability for God to not possess such properties. Only ase substances are metaphysically possible. Hence, it is a category error to demand properties be ase. Sarah Adams and John Robson propose aseity may come in restrictive and unrestrictive modes, similar to omnipotence or the principle of sufficient reason. So aseity may be defined as God is the fundamental asymmetrical ground for explanation for God's numerically distinct and inseparable properties that neither diminishes nor degrades the ase divine substance. On the first version of Christian complex theism, the divine properties are essential constituents of the Christian real essential definition, red, of God. So the definition of red. To be God is to be a particular object that is a triune being, eternally self-existent, omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect, the sole creator and sustainer of the universe. Or we could say of all reality. Moving to metaphysical coherentism. Sarah Adams and John Robson proposes a restrictive view of aseity, one according to which some kinds of dependence are compatible with maximal perfection. So complex theism may stipulate God as a divine substance is symmetrically and mutually dependent upon God's divine properties. I categorize this as a form of metaphysical coherentism, in which case aseity would be revised to affirm God's nature, construed as the divine substance and the divine properties conjoined, are neither created, caused, explained, nor depends upon anything external to the divine nature. Still, complex theism may be challenged as viciously circular insofar as the divine substance fully grounds the divine properties, and the divine properties fully ground the divine substance. Moreover, complex theism does not necessarily explain why God exists as a complex being. Hence, we may move to the second version of Christian complex theism for greater explanatory power. For the second version of Christian complex theism, I will roughly follow William Lane Craig and C.A. McIntosh. Excuse me. So, Dr. Craig proposes God is the Trinity, a tripartite complex being. Both Dr. Craig and Chad McIntosh, C.A. McIntosh, affirm God's parts, construed as divine persons of the Trinity, are uncreated, necessary, inseparable, and interdependent. C.A. McIntosh proposes further that each divine person as a part, qualitatively divine, partially grounds the whole divine substance. On this view, there is more than one way to be divine, at least two ways to be divine, as substance and properties, or as whole and parts, or to use traditional language, substance and subsistence, general essence, individual essence, or you can think of truth maker and truth bearer. Any one part does not fully depend on another part. Rather, any one part depends on the other two parts. All three divine persons as parts wholly ground the divine substance. It strikes me that McIntosh may extend his model to explain the whole Trinity, symmetrically grounds their shared numerically distinct divine properties. Nevertheless, McIntosh's proposal of ternary grounding of the divine persons, in which any one part depends on the other two parts, is immune from any bootstrapping. As McIntosh explains, his model is akin to a spider web structure, like coherentism, right? So he says that his model is akin to a web-like structure rather than a circular chain. Perhaps an example will clarify, and this comes from me. Take a triangle. A triangle is grounded by three sides or angles. We can label each side A, B, and C. If one takes the conjunction of any two sides of a triangle, it will be insufficient to ground the whole triangle. The conjunction of two sides as the full explanation of each other is viciously circular. And I'll repeat that. The conjunction of two sides as the full explanation of each other is viciously circular. Side A grounds side B, while side B grounds side A. But if a third side is introduced as partially grounding rather than wholly grounding, the triangle then I see a typo. If a third side is introduced as partially grounding rather than wholly grounding, the triangle then, the circularity is evaded. Since each side partially grounds the triangle, side A depends on side B and side C. Likewise, side B depends on side A likewise, side B depends on side A and side C. Moreover, side C depends on side A and side B. This reflects a web-like structure than a circular chain. At the center of the hub, composed of parts, is the hub, At the center of the web, composed of parts, is the hub, which serves as the ground for each auxiliary spoke of the web. On this view, at the center of explanation are the three divine persons as parts, which mutually, symmetrically, and completely ground the Trinity, the divine substance. The three divine persons as parts are interdependent. They mutually and symmetrically ground the whole Trinity and divine properties. And I put here as a side note, McIntosh could propose something else if he wanted to. He could say that the divine persons mutually ground the Trinity and asymmetrically ground their shared divine properties, such that the divine properties do not ground the divine substance. So he could take that view as well. Now, I already know some are going to object. Well, talking about God, talking about the Trinity, and saying that the divine persons are parts, doesn't that entail parthood, right? or as some colloquially call this, partialism, right? Does this not imply diminished divinity, since each part is not the whole Trinity? Dr. McIntosh addresses this in his paper on triseity, and Kevin Watson Jr. attempts to address this in his paper in the Corinthian, and Dr. Craig, he addresses it in his paper against Daniel Howard Snyder. And I think J.T. Passach's paper for his analysis of John Duns Scotus, which is entitled Duns Scotus on Identities, I mean Mereological Fusions in Theoria of 2021, I think it addresses this issue. What do we say? We say that parthood does not imply diminished divinity, since each part is categorically divine or qualitatively divine. Divinity does not come in degrees. If I can move this out of the discussion of divine and just talk about general cases, when we're talking about divinity, divinity is similar to, it is a categorical property, or we should say a qualitative property, not a quantitative property. The most ordinary examples is pregnancy. Pregnancy, someone is either pregnant or they're not, versus hunger. Hunger can come in degrees. You could be, a little hungry, or you could be famished, right? So here we're saying that divinity is qualitative. McIntosh uses the example of color. Something has the color of red or it does not, because it is categorical. Perhaps we can say the parts share the same trope of divinity, like William Hasker. Now, partialism is not an official heresy endorsed by a ecumenical council. However, Scott Williams argues in a paper, I don't think it's published yet, that the Sixth Ecumenical Council condemned views like Severus of Antioch and Bobby the Great that endorsed some Mereological model of the Trinity. So someone might argue, well, this is not conciliar. And that they might have an argument there. All right, continuing on. I say, given what Dr. McIntosh proposes, consequently, aseity is redefined by McIntosh as, he defines McIntosh as X has its explanation in itself if and only if X depends for its existence on nothing but its three interdependent proper parts. So we could revise aseity altogether to be immune from the bootstrapping objection from Lindsay Cleveland, and also be immune from the dilemma that Dr. Andani proposes. On both versions of Christian complex theism that we briefly surveyed, God is the metaphysical foundation for all reality. God is the sole source, support, sovereign, and standard of all reality. God is neither created, caused, nor depends, nor derives from anything external to God's nature. God necessarily exists in virtue of God's essential nature. God's numerically distinct attributes or properties are divine precisely because God possesses them in a mode that is from God and not from another. The divine substance's unique possession, fusion bond, ownership of the properties ground or constitute them divine. God is the property bearer, which entails the properties are divine. Those that affirm divine simplicity as numerical identity will resist this claim. They will insist that if a property is numerically distinct from the divine substance, it is both external and non-divine. But this is merely an unargued philosophical bias against any view of Christian complex theism. Moving on to the creator-creature distinction. On both versions of Christian complex theism, the creator-creature distinction is preserved with God's relation to the world. God creates all things from no thing. Creatio ex nihilo. An asymmetrical dependence relation obtains between God and the world with creation. This relation has a definite beginning. It is created, both the creation and the relation itself. God did not merely create a boundary point of the universe, but a definite starting point of physical time, space, and matter. Nothing about creation is essential to God to be God. It may be argued all change must be necessarily extrinsic to God, such that it could not be intrinsic to God. This is the claim of those that affirm absolute immutability. Yet, God undergoes some sort of change. Hear me out here. God goes from a state of eternally existing solitarily as triune without creation to a state of God creating and existing with creation. So God goes from being solitary as triune, and then God creates, and then God exists with creation. So what is the nature of change in creating? Generally, extrinsic change is explained by extrinsic change is explained by intrinsic change. A specific effect is explained by the properties and powers of its cause. If the properties or powers were different of a cause, then the effect would be different. But to posit a cause that could never change, that can produce different effects, is explanatorily vacuous. It is explanatorily a non-starter. Moreover, if divine cognition affirms both necessary and contingent knowledge, the contingent knowledge God possesses of the actual world would be different if God created a different world. If such a state of affairs is logically possible, then there must be a tight relation between intrinsic and extrinsic change. This demonstrates change must be intrinsic to ground extrinsic change. But if God is necessarily and absolutely the immutable eternal creator, then God modally cannot do other than what God does as God. There is no possible world in which God eternally refrains from creation, nor is there a possible world in which God creates a different world than the actual world, lest God cease to be necessarily and absolutely the immutable eternal creator. But can't God produce different effects while remaining necessarily and absolutely the immutable eternal creator? That's the question. And that's what those that affirm absolute immutability will raise. But that question is just a question. It needs to be demonstrated. This begs the question on the nature of change. It assumes change is extrinsic. But that needs to be demonstrated. But let's assume, even if change is extrinsic, there is no possible world in which God does not create in order for God to be the immutable and eternal creator. God must create to be the eternal creator. Creation as contingent does not logically preclude eternal coexistence with God, which is problematic. And I think some say that Thomas Aquinas affirmed that there is a possibility of an eternal creation. At least Aristotle believed in eternal creation. So I say, if there's an asymmetrical dependence relation between God, the creator, and creation, then creation depends on God for its existence, while God does not depend upon creation for God's existence. Indeed, this is true. If God is not necessarily and essentially the immutable creator, but if God is necessarily, think logically, metaphysically, and essentially the immutable eternal creator, then there is a mutual dependence. There's a mutual dependence relation of some sort between God and creation. And this would be intrinsic or intrinsic change that explains precisely how God is necessarily and essentially the immutable eternal creator. There has to be a necessary dependence relation between God and the world in order to explain how God necessarily and essentially is the immutable eternal creator. Appeals to the diffusion principle in Plato or Jonathan Edwards may be made here. But this entailment that God must create to be God is devastating. It is to affirm some sort of panentheism. And therefore, we should re-examine the nature of immutability so that we do not have to affirm these devastating consequences or entailments, which leads us to an evaluation of immutability. And we will have to stop here. We'll discuss immutability later and the Trinity. Please download the paper. Peace and God bless.